Our next session for the day is a special industry keynote brought to us by Gard, the Research Director for Global Services, Markets and Trends, IDC. Mr. Little's core research on digital transformation includes analyzing customer demand and vendor offerings for building new business processes, organizations, and systems using cloud, business analytics, enterprise mobility, and social business technologies. I now invite Gard Little to address our audience.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you. Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Gard Little, and I'm part of IDC's Worldwide Services Research Group. I look after our consulting, tech consulting, and system integration type research, and I'm really excited to present some of what our research is showing us and to talk about this, how we're going to adapt to this digitally transforming future that all of us are talking about. This is a problem that we all share. You as buyers of services and as customers, as producers, as individuals. This is what we're here to talk about. A little bit of background on me. I've been with IDC about 10 years, and all of that time searching and researching emerging opportunities. A lot of that's involved with cloud over the past few years and digital technologies, the things that Sandeep and others and Ulas have talked about. But before that, before the 10 years with IDC, I spent the bulk of my career, about 25 years, as a tech consultant, management consultant, and a manager of groups. So a lot of time selling and delivering services, the kind of things that Zenzar does, working with clients like yourself. So I really understand that part of the business. I understand what those challenges are, and I hope that I'm able to bring that experience to the research, and I hope as we work through what this common problem is that we have of adapting to this digitally transformed future, that this research I have informs you based on that kind of information. And when I talk to IT buyers, when I talk to suppliers in the market, we're all facing this common problem of how to adapt. And I'm going to share with you three of the main themes of what I talk about, modes of thinking about this and how to adapt and work in this environment. I also thought about this in the context of advice that I give to my children. My oldest daughter is just about to graduate university, and I realized that a lot of the advice that I give to my clients relates to her as she's transitioning into this work environment. So here are the three things that I've talked about with her. I've said, first of all, you need to think like an economist. You need to be able to use the tools from economics in the work that you do, however you do that. You need to think and be able to act like a developer also. Maybe not be a code developer, but understand that, understand the logic, understand the procedural things, what's possible, what's not possible. Bring that engineering mentality to whatever it is you do, even if you're not a coder. And the other thing you need to do is you need to think and be like an entrepreneur, and use that kind of business knowledge and marry that up to the technology and economics knowledge. Anybody see or know the image that's on the bottom of that chart there, the hippo roller? Just a quick show of hands. Anybody seen who know that? A few things. I picked this one on purpose because when we were preparing for this, Lavanya told me that many of you were from Africa. This is an example of innovation that was developed about 20 years ago in South Africa. It's called the hippo roller. It's for water carrying. And I picked it specifically because it's not super high tech. We're talking about carrying water here, right? That's something that's been an age-old problem, and it's an interesting, innovative solution that this NGO came up with. I also told my daughter it wouldn't be so bad if she learned a little bit of Chinese, but I'm not sure that that's going to happen. That may be a bridge too far for her. It certainly is for me, but it may not be for some of you. And I think that understanding the cultural and linguistic intricacies of a different language, anything in addition to your native language, is an important skill to have in that. So this is what we're going to do in the keynote. When I talk about the services industry and this challenge that we have, think like an economist, we'll share a little bit about that, a developer, and the innovation and entrepreneur. And I hope that these skills will help you to think about this challenge of how we're going to adapt to this digitally transforming future. So, first, the economist. What's the right digital strategy for a lower growth, zero interest rate type of world that we're living in? This is the economist question that we get put to by economists. And if you look at this example, you can see over the period from roughly 1980 until now, what has changed in terms of global GDP. Clearly, we're in an environment where the GDP growth rate is declining. And this creates challenges for us in several ways. One of them is because in this type of a declining GDP rate of growth, it's a lot harder to innovate. If you think across this time period, and I've used this time period for a couple reasons. One is it maps primarily to the main 3 generational transitions in technology. You can see that we've gone through ups and downs, and there certainly are waves of technological innovation that we've seen over that period. But in the declining areas, when the rate of GDP growth is going down, it's a lot harder to innovate. Now, why is that? Well, if we just think about it at an individual level, it's a lot harder to be innovative and to do the kind of research and development that Ulas and others talked about when you are worried about your future, when you're shrinking, when you're more in a defensive mode. If you think about it, if you're hungry, it's very hard to be innovative if you're hungry, if you're worried about where your next paycheck is coming from. So that growth is important for us in terms of the spirit and the confidence that it provides us to be able to drive this type of technological change. In terms of interest rates, if you look here at an example of the central bank policy rates over, again, this same period, you'll see, certainly for the developed economies and some of the regions that we've talked about here, we're approaching zero, very near zero. Now, obviously, there's some examples I put up. Brazil is one of a developing economy where policy rates are much higher. But in general, this lower rate world is where we've been living for the past couple of years and are likely to continue for several more. What is the challenge for us here? Well, it's twofold. If we think about it from an individual consumer perspective for a minute, low rates sound great. If you have a good credit rating, you can borrow money, and that's terrific. But the flip side of that, and one of the things that's driven or is an input to this kind of policy rate decision is people's expectations around inflation. So if you have very low expectations of inflation in the future, you're not as likely to consume. You may think that prices are not going to go up. There's not a reason to consume now. You might be able to put it off for a week or a month or a year. And those types of decisions obviously affect growth. They affect demand for products and services, and that's a challenge that we have. If you look at this on the industry side, I know many of you are from the financial services industry. There's a tremendous challenge here, obviously, in terms of what's the return on the capital that you're deploying. How do you create money in this kind of a low interest rate environment? It creates the potential for instability in the markets because it pushes people to seek higher yields, pushes them to do riskier things in that market. And so all of those things are challenges that we face when we think about how to adapt to this, how do we use technology in this environment. And what's interesting to me, looking at technology over this period of time, in these areas of higher growth, there has been a possibility to inject information technology into your businesses and get a productivity boost. And that's becoming less and less possible in and of itself. And if you think about some of the things that Sandeep talked about, you have to marry these technological innovations with changes to your business process organization. That's really what makes it a transformation. It's not just about injecting those technologies. Technology is becoming one of the factors of production along with labor and capital, but it doesn't have the same type of differentiation that it may have had in the past. And because of that, we face this additional challenge of what to do and how to look at that. Now, I'm in the services business and as an analyst, so I want to talk about what some of the data are that support kind of these larger global trends around interest rates and GDP growth. And I want to talk about services in particular. What is the growth rate for IT and business services around the market? This is the most recent data from IDC for 2016 around regional growth rates. And if you look at this, you'll see something that matches part of what I was talking about. In the developed world, low single-digit growth, primarily. There's a little bit of variation there, but it is something where when you compare it to some of the developing areas, there's more high single-digit growth. Latin America, Africa, these types of areas as well, lots of parts of Asia excluding Japan. But gone are the days when the services growth, the spending growth for these types of business and IT services was a multiple of GDP. Could have been a 2 or a 3 multiple in many cases. So again, I think there's evidence that we're seeing that the technology side of this is primarily shrinking in terms of its overall importance as a single factor of production. It needs to be combined with changes in process, changes in innovations to be able to help boost productivity more than what we've seen to date. Now, let's look at the same data, but from a services market perspective. Okay, what you're seeing here is a list of all of the 14 markets that IDC tracks. And it's plotting the growth rate for 2016 on the y-axis, and then across the bottom on the x-axis what the forecasted growth rate is between now, or at least when this forecast was done in 2020. And the size of the bubble is sort of a relative sense of the total spending in the market. I don't want to spend too much time on the sizes of the bubble, but I want to talk about what an economist would say looking at this. If you look sort of down and to your left, you see markets that are shrinking in size. IS outsourcing is an example of that. Now, from an economist perspective, this is interesting because it creates a question. Why is this shrinking and where is that money going? So if all you do is IS outsourcing, the market doesn't look great at this point, right? It used to be able to let a contract for $10 and now you renegotiate that contract and maybe it's $1. I'm exaggerating to make a point, but the truth is there is a shrinking that's going on. That could be a catastrophe if you're a provider and that's all you do, but what the economist asks is, what happens to that other $9? Where does it go? And IDC's research tells us that in over half the cases, it actually gets redeployed to other services. So look up and to the right, things like business consulting. Here's an example where that more efficient IT allows a substitution, according to The Economist, a substitution of spending to these other kind of markets. Things like business consulting that help us redefine business processes and business models to help us to create new innovative businesses, to create digitally transformed organizations. That's the kind of thing the economist would look at when thinking about that. And I would challenge you to do the same thing when you think about how you work with your providers, how you work within your organization. How are you going to redeploy and substitute when efficiencies get created through either technological change or otherwise? What is going to be your go-to service to help try to drive new growth and innovation? Now, we talked about driving productivity and what the strategies are for that. And I've listed some of them here on the chart. And if you think back to what Sandeep and Ulas and others have talked about, I think you'll see a lot of similarities here. On the left-hand side, input reduction. When we talk about productivity, we have to either reduce inputs or increase outputs or do a little bit of both. And these are some examples of the types of activities that you can do to reduce inputs. Certainly on the operational efficiency side, use things like outsourcing and managed services. You can reduce volume through lean technologies and lean approaches. You can adopt best practices, looking for advice from third-party guides around how to change your business or your IT processes and structures. Or you can develop new operational processes, and you use innovation and co-innovation, as Ulas talked about, to do that type of a thing. On the output side, conversely, to try to increase the value of the organization, you can use innovation management. That's why there's been such a huge increase in innovation. You can try to increase the volume of your products and services through implementing new technologies, new operational technologies, information technology, networks. You can make structural changes. You can implement the types of platforms that are talked about here. The Vinci is an example. You can use all of the different types of technologies that are developed through the R&D labs, like Zen Labs, and others to get a structural change to your organization. And you can also develop new products. So products and operations both use the same set of techniques in terms of innovation and co-innovation. But what I think is important is, again, to think as an economist about this. Sandeep talked about the return on digital. It's not good enough anymore just to inject these digital technologies without making some correlating process and organizational changes as you go about thinking about these. So that's the first part of what I want to talk about. The second part of what I want to talk about relates to being a developer or thinking like a developer. And my framing question for you is to think about this. Will our digital transformation future rhyme with the history of our IT industry? Samuel Clemens, one of the famous American authors whose pen name was Mark Twain, is widely credited with having said that history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And so I've sort of borrowed from Mark Twain to ask you to think about, is our history going to rhyme with that of the past? Now, before I give you my answer to what I think is going to happen, I want to just quickly talk about what we mean by digital transformation. I'm an analyst. Sorry, I have to always do this. I have to ground things and define them, what we're talking about. So take a minute to read that. Okay, so what we're talking about here are transforming business processes or organizations with technology. The primary technologies we've been dealing with for the past few years are things like cloud, enterprise mobility, analytics, social business, these types of things. They're now getting accelerated by things like Internet of Things and blockchain and all these other wonderful things. But what makes it a digital transformation is not just that it's digital, but that there is some sort of business transformation that has to occur, some change to process with it. So, my prediction is that the future is actually not going to rhyme that well with the past. And I'll tell you why I think this. I talked about the charts before, going back to 1980. That was about the time when I started my career out of university. And it also relates to this first period of technological change, what IDC calls the first platform of technology and growth. And that was primarily an era that was defined by the use of mainframe computers. And if you think about that era, if you have personal experience or you've talked to people that have personal experience, they will tell you it was dominated by large monolithic systems. There's this screen I put up, CICS. This was a transaction processing and monitoring system. So it was hard, but once I got into this, I started to learn about what did it mean to process transactions. And what did it mean to integrate these large monolithic systems? It took a lot of us as consultants to be able to pull these pieces together. There was a lot of custom code that was built. And all of that, while it took a while to understand, was fundamentally fairly easy once you got it to run. Now, as we moved into the early and mid-90s, we moved into what IDC calls the second platform of innovation and growth. This was dominated by client-server technologies. And what's interesting is that although the names changed, so instead of using CICS for transaction processing and monitoring, we went to something like a WebSphere. What it actually meant to process transactions, what it meant to integrate systems, that didn't fundamentally change. So in that sense, the first generation, the first platform and the second platform transition, that rhymed fairly well. Again, things changed. We saw the emergence of large software vendors like an SAP and Oracle that created very large monolithic applications for accounting and enterprise resource planning and those kinds of things. But fundamentally, the skills transferred fairly well. Now we move into what IDC calls the third platform of innovation and growth. And what's interesting is this is where I don't think it's going to rhyme. Now, this third platform, as I mentioned, is primarily defined by our use of global technologies, things like cloud, enterprise mobility, analytics, social business technologies. But you notice I put up this big pile of Legos. Why the Legos? Well, because we've really blown up these large monolithic systems from the second generation and created lots of small little bits of technology. They have a lot of potential to work interdependently or independently or together, but in and of themselves, many smaller things. So my belief is what it means to process a transaction changes. Instead of saying process an invoice or execute a purchase order, it gets broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. And so the integration task becomes much more different, and what it means to integrate these also changes. In the first two platforms, we were the integration mechanism. We, the consultants, the service providers, you, the clients, you integrated all of these disparate databases and applications and different technologies and locations. But the truth is, in the third platform, there's a substitution effect that goes on that the economists would tell us about from labor to software, because now with cloud integration software, some of these integrations can be taken care of manually. I'll give an example of that later, but there's many instances where the cloud pulls all of these distributed and disparate elements to the core, and that creates a difference that's not quite the same as what we had in the prior platforms. So what are we going to do? How does that actually work on the third platform? And I will share with you this story about Legos as a metaphor for clouds. How many of you have ever seen the application Yo? Just curious. Anybody see this? One hand over there, a couple of hands. Okay. My son showed this to me a few years ago, and he said, "Dad, I want to show you this application called Yo. You look at this." And he had it on his phone. He goes, "See, I can put down on the list of names here. I can push a button if I want to send a Yo to one of my friends. I push it. It sends the message Yo." And I thought to myself, "Oh my goodness, what an absolute waste of time." My son should be studying economics, he should be studying mathematics, Chinese, he needs to learn how to be a developer. There's all this adapting that we have to do to this digitally transformed future. Oh my God, what am I going to say? But I held my tongue, and I'm glad I did, because in that moment, I had this insight that Yo was perfectly like a Lego brick. It was one item by itself, it did one thing, compared to SAP, Oracle that did thousands of things. It was just elemental in its essence, and I thought that's very interesting. And so I started thinking about this and how that works. And I think if you look at some examples of what some companies are doing, you're starting to see this idea of composable components. If you look at Amazon Web Services, their logo, they've got little blocks on there. I think they're sort of using that same thing. So I've been using this for a while, and if you think about this, if you work through with me the metaphor for a minute, think about it if you have kids, or if you have in your extended family kids and you've ever been on the ground and sort of playing, there's an experience that I've had, and I'd ask you about it too. If you look on the left, you can see what I can build with Legos. That's when I'm there with my kids. Those are the kind of things that I can build. And what's on the right is an example of when you have real Lego engineers, the kind of things that you can build. They start to become more valuable and useful as an input to that. And so my question for you, and what I want you all to think about, even if you're not a developer, if you're not a programmer, is how do you get to that environment with those Lego engineers? How do you know who's going to do the building and the integrating of that? So if you've ever tried to build a Formula One race car with Legos or a Starship or whatever, usually the kit comes with some instructions. Those instructions, that's the know-how to build and integrate these technologies. Where's that going to come from in our digitally transformed future? I think it's going to come from a couple places. Traditionally, and it will continue to come from suppliers, possibly with some subcontractors, who will have that kind of knowledge to be able to build and integrate these systems. They'll have the instruction manuals. And a lot of times you'll hear about this as accelerators or predefined solutions or solution components that can be wrapped around a particular industry problem that you have. So that's one place they're going to come from. But I would say that in this digitally transformed future, there's another place that they're going to come from, which are these supplier ecosystems. Other customers, other consumers, other players in your industry, or other adjacent industries that build these components but create reusable ones. Could be by industry or could be by crowdsourcing itself. Because it's interesting, one of the things that having all of these communication technologies allows us to do is to work more independently and to create the ability for individuals who may not be permanently organized and employed by an organization to contribute. So think about custom app development example, of developing a mobile application. If that gets broken out into little constituent parts, some of those can be crowdsourced, essentially shopped around on the internet, defined as a series of specifications of things that have to be done, and then can be delivered over that same vehicle. So that becomes part of this build and integrate capability that we have. And it's what to think about, again, not just because you're a developer, but because of the need to think like that and to use that technology and that approach to your best benefit. So, regardless of where you get this, regardless of whether you're a buyer or a supplier, the other thing I want to share with you is what some of our research is showing around what's going on in terms of contracts, services contracts. IDC tracks these, and what we found is that the market participants, both buyers and suppliers, are going to need to adjust the scale and the speed and the cost for contracting for services and for buying services to really stay relevant. So we have a database, it's got 60, 70,000 contracts in it going back almost to 2000, where we track these things. I've pulled out a slice of this starting around 2006, when the cloud really in earnest started to be picking up and we started to see more and more transactions. And if you look across all three of these areas, in terms of project-based work like consulting, outsourcing work, as well as support and training, you see something interesting in terms of the number or the scale of projects is increasing in all those cases. The length of projects is decreasing, except in the case of support and training. And the cost of these, held constant in 2006 dollars, is down dramatically. So this is the challenge for you as consumers and buyers of technology. It's a challenge for folks like Zenzar as suppliers to figure out, how do we stay relevant in this market? We not only have to change our delivery, we have to change how we sell and how you as buyers receive and work with us in that kind of a sales environment. So it was interesting. One of my clients said this to me. He said, you know, Gard, we're going from hunting elephants to hunting rabbits. Everything's getting smaller. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Yeah, you're right. And I didn't think about it at the time, but later on, I put up what I wrote there, which is, yeah, and you know, it's actually takes a lot of rabbits to make up for one elephant. Think about the outsourcing example that I talked about before. And actually, the way that you catch rabbits is very different than the way that you go about hunting an elephant. So don't just think about the delivery side of this. Think about the sales side. Think about how your vendors go to market, how they interact with you around the sales motion. This has a potential benefit. When we think about shorter projects, some people get nervous because they think, how am I ever going to get anything done? You know, if everything's a little 6-month project, how do I get the big picture 2-3 year projects done? And there is a need to have an overall comprehensive architecture, to understand how all the pieces fit together, to understand the instruction manuals, as I talked about. But at the same time, those shorter projects actually de-risk some of the engagements for the providers as well. There's a benefit to them, because if they're not locked into a 5-year contract, you know, with little wiggle room, they have more opportunity to be flexible with you, to adapt, and to work in that environment. So that's really the second thing I wanted to talk about, is how to think and use the knowledge and the logic of being a developer to work in this environment and adapt to this digitally transformed future. And now I want to talk about this third area, about being an entrepreneur and an innovator. And I want to ask you this: how will entrepreneurs thrive in this new as-a-service economy? I think there's 3, perhaps 4 things that are key to this kind of survival that I would challenge you to think about when you work with folks like Zenzar and when you work in your environment to figure out what's going to be the response to this digitally transformed future. How am I going to adapt to this? First one is to think about emergence and reductionism. Now, I've taken this chart here. This is the famous Hosukai print of the wave. I'm sure some of you have seen this before. And I asked one of my sons to digitize the right-hand side of this for a minute, because I want to do an experiment with you. When you think about the ocean, how many of you, when you think about the ocean, just a quick raise of hands, think of it in its entirety? The ability of the waves to crest over the boat, to think about the effect of the moon on the tides, to think about the ability of the ocean to support commerce, to support life itself. How many of you think about the ocean that way, kind of that big picture world? Anybody? 1 person? 2 people? So there's a few people to think like that. That sort of corresponds more to the left-hand side of the Hosukai picture. Now, I digitized the right side. How many of you, show of hands, when you think about the ocean, how many of you think about individual molecules of water? H2O. All getting sort of summed up into that big wave. How many people think like that? Anybody? Nobody. Interesting. So, I think you need to see both perspectives. It's very important to see both. not just as a technologist, not just as the Lego brick builder or the assembler, but to see that as the innovator and the entrepreneur. Think about the hippo roller as an example, right? Think about water carrying. It's been around for a while. But someone had the challenge of thinking about, if we take a wheelbarrow idea and merge that with the idea of a water-carrying vessel, we can make an innovation. Again, not anything to do with IT, but it was breaking down the problem, building it up again. Seeing both of those perspectives is very important. And if you try to apply this in your work, I think you'll find that it's easier to try to adapt to these transformations, and it's easier to think about how are you going to work and thrive in this type of an as-a-service economy. The next thing I want to talk about is the fact that ecosystems are becoming much more complex, and that as entrepreneurs and innovators, you need to understand that they're becoming increasingly complex. And to think about this, I'll tell you a story, which is that if you imagine back to secondary school when you studied earth science, we learned about ecosystems. And here's a really simplistic model of an ecosystem. It's just there for illustration purposes, but if you remember back to those things when we thought about ecosystems, we learned about producers and consumers, and there was an integration, and there were webs of food and energy passed through different layers. And there's the sun and the effect of that on the marine ecosystem, and all of these different things. And so when you're in high school and when you're learning this type of thing, it's very helpful to have this type of simplistic model so you can understand what that is like. But the truth is, as you get older, you realize, that chart from the textbook, it's not quite that simple. It gets you started, but the actual complexity that we see in the world is tremendously larger than what gets captured in those introductory types of examples that we learned from in school. And so I had this connection that, that's sort of like what we saw on the second platform. When we think about where we are now, when we think about the SAP ecosystem or the Oracle ecosystem as an example, you had a large monolithic player in the center, fairly controlling of the environment. You had a group of implementers. You had all the customers, different industry groups, and specialists and users. But it was a fairly simple environment. It was much more highly controlled. It sort of reminded me of that earth science ecosystem chart from way back when. And the reality is much, much different. As we've moved into this third platform, as we move into that, I'll give you one example from IoT. This is from my research colleagues that work with me on the Internet of Things. Vastly more complex ecosystem, both in terms of the number of participants and also the types of participants. So if you look along the sort of the diagonal, you can see what I'm talking about. You have not just one sort of independent software vendor who's controlling the whole environment. No one's really controlling the IoT. It's impossible to control the entire ecosystem. But you've got all these different parts. You've got folks that are involved in designing and building sensors, and the network carriers for passing information between the sensors and the core. You've got the cloud and the IoT gateways. You've got all sorts of other types of players that do open data platforms and IoT platforms and actual integration of all of these pieces itself. So vastly more complex. It's more complex because of the different types of players as well as the number. And as you know, and as the entrepreneurs think about this, what's important to understand is all of these relationships grow in terms of geometric size, who can be a producer, who can be a consumer. The other thing that's important to think about, and actually one of the differences that doesn't rhyme completely well with ecosystems, is around energy. When you think about that, typically energy gets consumed and move through the ecosystem. But unlike that, information, the flow of information doesn't just get consumed and then it can't be consumed a second time. You can't do that. With information, we have a slightly different flavor of what happens because information can be consumed or reused more than once. But this type of ecosystem, I think, will be increasingly important to understand. And I hope that as you think about this, as you try to be entrepreneurs in your business and innovate, that you will try to look for partners who aren't trying to control the ecosystem in particular, but who are trying to navigate it, to understand their unique value in it, and to help you understand what your unique value is going to be in the ecosystem, because you're part of it as well. The final thing I wanted to talk about in terms of what innovators and entrepreneurs have to do differently relates to thinking about swapping out older ad hoc analytics for different platforms. And I know that you've heard a little bit about this, and we talked about this idea of platforms helping increase productivity. The focus on platforms, both at Zenzar and elsewhere, is very important to this. And analytics is a great example. When you think about all of the analytics work that was done sort of prior to, say, 2006 or before, it was very much on-premise, built-for-purpose type applications. There was sort of an ad hoc nature to what was created. It wasn't primarily a platform-driven exercise. And I think that this is going to change. We're going to see increasing number of analytic platforms that are generated. And I would challenge you to think about how do you make that change from a fit-for-purpose, individual, on-site, on-premise type application that does ad hoc work to one that's a little bit more general purpose, that does some of the kind of things that you saw about in what Ulas and Sandeep talked about. Now, I put up the picture of Watson here to tell you a funny story. So IBM showed us this. I'm sure all of you have seen and heard about the ability that IBM created to play Jeopardy against some of the world's best players of Jeopardy. And when IBM Labs, when they showed this to us afterwards, and they kind of let us get under the covers and see it and play with it, there was a group of analysts from all the different analyst firms. We played it. We lost, but we got close. But we almost got to the point where we could buzz in and answer the questions. It was interesting to learn about how they built this general purpose ability to answer questions. And I thought to myself afterwards, I said, gee, this looks a lot like analyst as a service to me. And the IBM folks said, no, Gard, no, this is not about that, And so, once I sort of got over that initial reaction that I think a lot of us have as humans about this idea of software substituting for the decision-making activities or capabilities that we've had in our lives so far, they pointed out that no, the actual point here is to augment what you're doing. It's not to replace you. It's not analyst. It's the assistant to the doctor. If you're a doctor, it's an assistant to you, not a replacement for you. And, it's interesting to think about that both in terms of where they've gone from a single-purpose machine. When Watson played Jeopardy, it was a self-contained machine, so very much like the older ad hoc systems that were built for purpose. In other words, when it played Ken Jennings, it wasn't allowed to Google the answer, right? It had to all be sort of self-contained to be able to compete fairly against the humans. But as Watson has evolved into a platform, it again has gotten broken down into constituent parts. You can see some of the sort of what they call them cogs. They're like the individual Lego bricks that get done. And it becomes, if you look at what they've done with things like the healthcare system and others, an assistant to not necessarily the doctor in and of itself. So think about that from a platform perspective. I have one more that I wanted to share with you, which is the final thing to think about in terms of breakthroughs. To thrive as innovation and entrepreneurs, you're going to need to eliminate the old services trade-offs. Now, I told you that I used to be a consultant. I spent 25 years, management consultant, tech consultant. This is how I always worked. This is how I made whatever success I made. It was by using this services trade-off. When I worked with my clients, I said, there's 3 kinds of service. You get to pick 2. I get 1. Because if I don't get 1, I go broke. I go bankrupt, I get fired, not good, and we're going to lose the economic relationship we have. The economic relationship we have is founded on this idea that we've got 3 levers. You get to pick 2, I get to pick 1. And I'm sure this resonates with some of you. If you've ever worked with service providers, this is why things work the way they do. But what's interesting is, as we adapt in this digitally transformed future, I believe we get to a point where we can actually choose all 3. How is that possible? Right? How can we can't sort of fundamentally change the laws of economics. That's true. The way it's possible, and I'll give you an example. We talked about cloud integration before. Okay, if you think about what it meant to be an integrator as a service provider. When you hired someone to integrate disparate systems, I mean, these days you might imagine how, if I wanted to integrate SAP and Salesforce, how would I do that? The way you would go about doing this is you would hire consultants, they would create a map, they would map out the definitions of all the databases, they would show you how the thing's connected, they would run it, they would do some special coding, they would test it. In a few weeks, a month, or whatever later, you would have the ability to map these two systems together. Now, with the cloud integration service, a lot of that work is embedded in the software. So if you look at something like a Dell Boomi as an example, that allows you to map, say, an SAP to an Oracle very rapidly. In fact, there are multiple customers who are already using it. And so as a service, as a continuous service, they are integrating these. And if you tell it, merge SAP or integrate SAP, I want to be able to share data with my Salesforce and SAP systems, it will show you the mapping that the 50 clients or the 100 clients that are actually working right now on Boomi, using it to integrate it, do it. Here's the map. You can change it if you want, of course, but it's already done. And if you want to integrate it, we will run that as an integration service for you. So that's an example where you get good, cheap, and fast all in one. And what's interesting is, in terms of substitutions and what happens to all the people when you don't have a bunch of consultants running around manually integrating things anymore, what do they do? What do they end up doing? Well, they can do more higher value-added activities. If you think about the types of advisory and consulting work that we talked about, it pushes them from the center of the services lifecycle, the doing part, more to the upfront side in terms of planning, or onto the back end side in terms of support and customer care and creating new models for service, that type of a thing, that integrate into what you're doing. So that is the fundamental challenge that we have. I think it's the fundamental thing you all have. And as we think about this problem of ours, of how we're going to adapt to this digitally transformed future, I hope this has been helpful. I hope that you'll be able to think like economists, code developers, and entrepreneurs, and with that, we should be able to adapt more easily to this digitally transformed future. Thank you very much.